So system design questions like design Twitter, I have a theory that literally part of the reason that it's asked to candidates is just to scare them. What do you think of that theory?
Yeah, I mean, maybe for some interviewers. I mean, I've been on both sides of this design interview, and I don't think I was trying to scare people, but I do think there's an element of just give people a hard problem and see how they handle it. Certainly, a lot of interviewers want to see how candidates react under pressure, which I think is deeply misguided, because the kind of pressure you have in an interview is very different from the kind of pressure you have on the job.
Yeah. Do you think interviews are more a assessment of skill for programming, or do you think that they're more of an assessment of how programmers handle anxiety in a group setting? Seriously.
Definitely anxiety, like your ability to manage anxiety is a huge factor. How confident you are is a huge factor. Depending on the interview, I do think interviews measure skill. Like there is some signal you get out of almost every type of interview. But by doing these design interviews, you're definitely making it hard for some people who might be very good on the job, but who struggle with this kind of sit down and architect a system from scratch under pressure question.
Yeah, they're ultimately about as predictive as a coin flip for on the job performance.
Are you quoting research there, or is that a hot take?
Yeah. No, that's not a hot take. And there's at least one journal article that I don't have written down anywhere, so I can't cite the source, but I remember it saying that programming interviews were more of a assessment of anxiety, your ability to deal with anxiety more so than on the job performance. And yeah, it's funny because you'd think the prompts would be anxiety lowering. If we all agree the anxiety part of it sucks, then you would think that we would agree that maybe we want to ask questions that are going to lower the stakes so I can see what you're good at, kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's kind of an incentive problem, right? Like these large tech companies, they have so many applicants. It's like right now, the problem is filtering the candidates. It's not kind of finding the good people from the candidates. So if you have a system that's going to drop 50% of the good people, it's not necessarily a problem as long as there's enough strong hires left in the pool that you're not filtering out,
Right. So did you ever ask design Twitter as a system design question as an interviewer?
No, I never asked design Twitter. This is back in my days at Zendesk, but our design interview was more focused around the problem domain. So we would ask questions like, you have to build a system that handles like storing Olympic results or something, and then we'd go really deep into like the database structure effectively. So it was really more like relational database stuff, and then would get into scaling at the end. But it was never like your system sucks, like do 10 times as many users. Okay, now do 100 times as many users. It was never like that. I feel like those interviews are kind of often fishing for specific scaling strategies as well, which is a bit unfair on like
for the company fishing. We want, what do you mean? I haven't heard that. I think that's so cool.
I mean, like, for instance, they'll have some idea in their head of like, oh, here's how, Twitter works. We want to hear you talk about like putting events on an event bus and reading them off instead of having services talk to each other directly. And they'll just kind of ask leading questions until they get that, which I don't know. I guess it's fair, but I think there's probably more mileage out of saying, do you have experience with event buses, and let the candidate talk about that.
That is so cool. I have like several different things that are branching off from this. I would say the first thing is that I noticed about your Zendesk interview, your question, and is that it's unbranded.
Yeah, that's right. It's a little bit more generic.
Yeah, but that's part of your advice of designing good systems is also you can have unbranded components when you're discussing how you're designing your system. You don't need to say Kafka because you read about that on a blog post online. You can talk about something. What do you think about the idea of candidates not optimizing for branded components in a design interview, but rather optimizing for just the concept for the component to avoid the problem of naming a technology and then the interviewer saying, well, what about an alternative technology? Yeah.
I mean, this is maybe a good opportunity to sort of talk about what I think like design, like system design is, which is taking like components and putting them together in ways that produce like a system, which sounds kind of silly, but when you give it more details, I think it sounds a bit more compelling. So if like, when we talk about like designing an algorithm, often what we're talking about is building a data structure or putting together data structures. So your basic components are things like pointers and variables, but like arrays, hashes, trees, lists, linked lists, queues, all of these kind of like basic sort of structures. When you're designing like systems, it's the same problem, but your components are like more abstracted. So you have components like databases, like queues like Kafka, but of course any queue will work. Caches, servers, proxies, all of these kind of things are what you're putting together instead to like build this system. And I think good system design interviews try to like capture the ability to construct systems out of those components. And you don't need to like reference specific brands for that to work, because, you know, there is a difference between whether you're using like Memcached or Redis for your cache. Like those two tools do operate differently, but in like the sense of sort of broad system design, it doesn't matter that much. If you're the important thing is to sort of recognize the situation that could be improved with a caching layer or a proxy, whether that proxy is HA proxy or Nginx or something else.
Yeah, I love the definition. One of the first things I can think of, to your point here, is that talked to a bunch of FANG interviewers the last couple of years, and one of the most common red flags would be a candidate saying, let's use a branded technology like Memcached. And then the interviewer would then say, well, then why not Redis? If immediately, if they don't have an answer, it's a huge red flag. And what I am now saying, built on what you've taught me in this post, and you're reinforcing in this post, and what you're trying to show is in the community in this post that you most recently had on Hacker News that did really well, is that if you try less to impress and try a little bit more to actually do something that is workable now, 60 minutes, that is going to be simple, that it leads to decisions such as, well, let's have some kind of caching layer here, as opposed to let's have Redis here. And that decision to just discuss it in those terms, it's actually a safer decision in an interview.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the interview, really. I mean, there are some interviews where I think they are fishing for specific technologies and specific answers. Like giving interview advice is always really, really hard because every company interviews in a totally different way. It's easier to give system design advice because every company designs systems in kind of the same way, because the principles are more transferable. Whereas interviews, sometimes you're chasing what individual people want to see, which is very hard to predict. So I'm always cautious about giving interview advice, and I'm always much less cautious about giving system design advice.
What about less even interview advice and more like what you would do in an interview? Like, let's say you go to like a NoSQL shop like Amazon. Do you say that you're going to use NoSQL because you're running the risk of them being dogmatic about technology choice?
Look, I think if you're interviewing at a place that you know uses a particular technology, it would be pretty silly to not try and design along those lines. Just because if you do get the job and you are going to work there, like if I got hired into Amazon as a staff engineer or something, whatever their equivalent level is, and I came in on my first week and I was like, we're going to use all of these they use relational databases for some things, I'm sure. But if I came in and I said, like, we're going to use relational databases for everything, that's a decision I'm making. Like, that would not fly. Like, that would not work. You have to kind of design a system where it is, right? No matter what your personal preferences are. And that's how you learn as well. It's by coming in and working on systems that don't necessarily match how you would design it. But, if you work on a system like that for 6 months, you will see what the strengths are that maybe you hadn't anticipated. One like silly example is I thought Slack chat ops were a really, really bad way to manage any kind of operational problem before I joined GitHub. I'm still like mildly suspicious about the practice, but GitHub uses Slack chat ops really well, and it does work. And there are huge benefits that I just had not anticipated, like having them be searchable, having the history of commands be in some public log where people can look at it in Slack. Like, that is a benefit to using chat ops that I hadn't anticipated. So I would encourage people to just kind of meet the services they're using where they're at more, and come in with less preconceptions about what the ideal service would be and how we're going to get from there to here.
And maybe interviewers too, less preconceptions about what good is, about what a good answer is, I feel like.
Maybe. I think when you're an interviewer, you want to filter out. Yeah, like, you're right that interviewers should I think be pretty ecumenical about the range of answers they're willing to accept, for sure, because that's what a good engineering team has, like a variety of opinions and a variety of all kinds of things. I do think it's fair for a company like, say, Amazon to filter on candidates that are interested in the kind of technology they're using. I don't think that's particularly unreasonable.
Yeah. Cool. So let's go into one of the topics that you talk about, which is, when it comes to good system design, how important is state?
How important is state? State is extremely important. I think this is something you sort of see a lot when you read about system design, you watch talks about system design, is that the hard part is state. Whenever I'm working on a stateless system, I'm always in the back of my head breathing a sigh of relief, because I know it just can't get that bad. You only get into really bad tangles with state. Let's take one like really common piece of system design advice, which I think is a good piece, which is that you should make invalid
Mhm.
states unrepresentable in your system. That's a really common piece of advice. But that's all about state. That's basically saying,
Hmm.
don't have one database saying that the state of the world is X and another database saying that the state of the world is Y, because if they disagree, suddenly you have this irreconcilable problem where your system has to decide which of them is correct and just really does not have the tools to do that in the moment. If you can make it so there's only one source of truth, then you just never get into that situation. So that's like one of about 10,000 instances where you need to think really carefully about state when you're designing your systems. Incidentally, that's also why this idea of like we'll just put a caching layer in here is not a good idea. Like caches are great. I love caches. I use caches. But like when you learn about caches, you want to put them everywhere. And then the more you learn about caches, the more you want to take them out and not put them anywhere. Because as soon as you have a cache in front of something, you have two sources of truth. You have two kind of databases which may diverge. And obviously what's in the cache is not the source of truth. But if you have a service talking to some service that has a cache, you don't really know whether you're getting the cached result or the non-cached result. That's fine most of the time, but it introduces complexity that you have to think about in the design in general. If you can speed something up without putting a cache in front of it, you should do that instead of putting a cache in front of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to say this earlier, but do you ever find this when good design looks underwhelming? Does this happen? Is that mainly something that you notice in interviews, or is that mainly in the field?
In the field, for sure. Nobody even
So
tries to give you underwhelming design in interviews. They all try to give you complex stuff.
yeah. Yeah. So are there, as a staff engineer where, cross org influence is really important? Is that one of the places that it comes into play when you're trying to get buy-in for an architectural decision that you have? If you're going for simplicity, then that kind of that complicates getting buy-in.
I think I disagree with that, actually. I think the simpler your idea is, the easier it is to get buy-in, actually, internally.
Hmm.
And maybe that's a statement about the kind of companies I've worked in. I've been lucky enough to work in companies where like simple design was sort of rewarded. But I think one problem that a lot of staff engineers and a lot of principal engineers face when they come into new areas is they try to do a redesign and they inevitably come up with something quite complex for a whole variety of reasons. The main one is just that it's easier to come up with complex designs than simple designs. But it's hard to sell a complex design down. It's easy to sell it up. Like it seems impressive enough to convince sort of executives that it's a sensible decision, but it's hard to sell it down to engineers, I think, because engineers often look at a complex design and they see all the points where it can go wrong. So the simpler you can make any design you're trying to sell across multiple teams, in my experience, the better. Ideally, like it's not even a design at all, and it's just like one thing. If it rises to the level of a design, you're going to have a hard time.
Wow, that is so interesting. I did not plan to talk to you about this, but what do you think was the hardest part to go from a senior engineer to a staff engineer
The hardest part. I mean, there's lots of hard parts.
for you as an individual?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. I want to start by saying that the biggest factor is luck. So like I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff I did to go from senior to staff, but I want to be really clear that like it's not, you can't really power through it with engineering skill or talent. Like you do have to get lucky. And I got lucky twice. But that aside, like what the hardest part about going from senior to staff, I think, is having tangible results. So when you go from a mid-level to senior, the work you can point to justify that move is work internal to the team. So it's work that your manager already knows about. It's work that engineers already know about. And it just doesn't have to be that externally impressive. It can be you did a good job on these like normal team projects. So it's pretty easy to come by. If you want to go from mid-level to senior, you can do it just by like killing the work that people put in front of you and doing a great job on it. That's fine. Going from senior to staff, the people who have to approve that are no longer in your team. They're no longer necessarily in your org. They're higher up the chain, or they're at GitHub, for instance, you have to have buy-in from other staff engineers in the org who sort of aren't really part of your group at all and don't have technical context on your work at all. So what you need are accomplishments that are legible to those people, which is a very different kind of thing. It requires, as I said earlier, it requires luck. It requires being put on these projects that have visibility across the org. And that's the hard part. It's being put on those projects, doing like a good enough job on those projects, which again is partially luck because some projects are just hard to do a good job on. And then it's sort of selling that to the rest of the org. So it's this kind of, you have to have 2 or 3 times where you have been put on a piece of work that is important and is visible, and you need to be able to talk about that in a way that the people making the decision on your promo packet have already heard about it, and they see it in your packet and they think, oh yeah, that's right. Like Sean did do a really good job on that. And that's not easy. That takes time to set up. It takes buy-in from your manager to set up.
Yeah. And getting on high visibility projects. I mean, that in itself, like for you as an individual, even if you did get lucky, I'm sure you had some kind of path that you were at least trying to carve out for yourself to get on high visibility projects. What would you say was like your approach to just getting on high visibility projects?
Yeah, well, there's two components to it. The first is that it absolutely has to be deliberate. You have to be like trying to do it, which means that you have to talk to your manager. Basically, your manager has to be on site, and your manager has to be looking out for these opportunities. Because these high visibility projects, when they come up in the org, typically they're kind of shopped around, and then managers nominate people to go and work on them. So you have to be like, you and your manager have to be on the same page about this before those conversations happen. So your manager knows that they can put you in the ring. The other half of it is like more like technical. You have to do a good enough job in general that you have like a strong engineering reputation enough. Because for these high visibility projects, a lot of the time there's this kind of word of mouth going on where engineers are like, oh, can you get me this person from this group who I've worked with before? They're really good. And that really just depends on like how you're seen like technically in the org, which is, difficult to build up that reputation.
Well, I heard this thing a couple days ago that, like when it comes to like mentorship and being a go-to person, basically that means you have a good reputation. And that sometimes people will say, oh, people come to me for stuff. I'm probably at that level of I have a good reputation. And I heard the argument that maybe they just come to you when everyone else is busy or there's no other option. And basically a good sign of reputation is people coming to you all the time. Or consistency. A manager was talking about consistency being an important thing for being promoted from senior to staff. And the incoming requests from other engineers in your org should be consistent. It shouldn't be they only come to you sometimes or, when everyone else is maybe working on other things. How important is that level of consistency for other engineers to come to you? How important is that to the reputation piece of this? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends. And it depends on a number of things, but one of the things it depends on is who is coming to you. So moving from like mid-level to senior, you need to be the go-to person for like the more junior people on your team. That's a condition. That's a condition everywhere I've worked. But for staff, the people who need to be coming to you, I think, are a little different. It has to be a bit more tilted towards like managers and product managers, and a little bit tilted away from like engineers. I mean, it's still good if engineers come to you. It's still a good sign. It means you're helpful. It means you like know things that they want to know. For sure, consistency is still a good sign. Like if you have a lot of engineers coming to you asking you to explain things to them, that's great. But you also, I think for that staff promotion, you need it to be the point of contact for some managers and some product managers too. And you need to be the point of contact for other very senior engineers in different parts of the org. You need to be the person who they trust to give you a straight answer about the technical state of some project or process in your org.
What would be a common request from an engineering manager in that context?
Typically, it's just data gathering. So typically it's like, hey, we might want to do this thing in your area. How hard would it be? And that's not a request for an estimate. That's really a request for like is this possible or not? Like typically the answer is like, yeah, we can do that. You can talk to us about it. Or that's just not something we're set up for. You should talk to this other org and try and do this other thing instead. That's the kind of answer you're giving, not a 6 weeks for 2 engineers kind of answer.
Is that more the product manager answer? The 6 weeks for 2 engineers kind of? But what? Yeah.
Sometimes, in my experience, it's sort of much the same. You're giving the same kind of technical context. You're sort of giving people an idea basically of what's doable and what's not doable.
Right.
Just because, I don't know, managers and product managers have a really hard job. They have to make all these decisions that like steer the org, and sometimes they have to do it with very little technical context. And that's not because they're not technical. It's because the amount of context you need for these individual decisions is so high. I have a lot of technical context on many parts of Copilot. There are tons of parts of Copilot where I have no technical context and I have no idea. And I would have to go and figure it out, and it might take a long time. But like, even for someone like me who has this context in other areas, I have to go and figure it out. A manager who has to make these decisions that touch on all kinds of areas, they just can't do it without support from engineers. They can't do it without engineers they trust kind of giving them answers to these specific questions.
You've been working on Copilot for a while.
Yeah, for a couple of years. I took a year off Copilot to work on a project called GitHub Models, but now I'm back. Now I'm back on Copilot.
What is
GitHub Models is GitHub's attempt to I feel like I'm shilling. It's GitHub's
I
attempt
asked.
GitHub Models is GitHub's attempt to deliver a inference API to all GitHub users. So you know how like OpenAI and Anthropic and Azure have their inference APIs where you can talk to a large language model and get completions or chat responses back. Well, GitHub Models is kind of GitHub's attempt to do that for free to everyone.
Nice.
The rate limits are fairly strict and the context window is fairly low, but if you want to get started, like there is genuinely no better way to get started developing with AI than GitHub Models, because you can do it with any GitHub token like right now.
Nice.
It was a really exciting
for
project
total newbies. Sorry, for total newbies too.
Yeah. I mean, it's just an API, right? So you can, if you're writing your like hello world with LLMs, your like 5 lines of code that call the OpenAI API, yeah, you can use GitHub Models for that, and you don't have to go and get an OpenAI token. You don't have to go and put a credit card into them. You can just kind of start messing around.
So how did you get on that high visibility project, Sean? Were you intentional about that, or did they pull you over to that? Like just in your own journey of going from Copilot to Models back to Copilot as a staff engineer, talking about getting on high visibility stuff?
Yeah, well, I got pulled onto it. So I was working on Copilot
Nice.
at the time, and I got told, hey, there's this super secret project, because this was obviously before we'd launched it. Would you come on and kind of take us through to shipping? And then we shipped it, and there was some real appetite from users, and we expanded it into a bigger team. And that's sort of what I did for a year, which was a lot of fun. But it was, I think it was really just off the back of, I don't know, people like knew me and thought I would be a good fit for the project.
I have one final question for you. You're obviously somebody who's working on some really important pieces of technology, like all of the LM focused stuff, whether it's Copilot or, models at GitHub. When you think like long-term about the industry outside of all the kind of craziness and the doom and gloom that people are experiencing right now, what hope do you have for kind of engineers as a collective?
What hope? Man, I don't think anyone knows where this stuff is going. To the extent that I have hope, it's that tools have always gotten more complicated, and human judgment has always been relevant in like using these tools. The set of tasks that engineers have been asked to do has shifted from more low-level stuff to more high-level stuff over the course of even my career, but over the course of the entire history of software engineering. My hope is that this is just more of the same, and in 50 years, we'll all be using some variant of like language model-based tooling, but there'll still be a place for software engineers to apply their own judgment and make these kind of general high-level decisions.
Hear, hear. Sean, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
See you.